Hey everyone, I got a question the other day from a viewer, a subscriber, and rather than give a poorly thought out, really drawn out, boring written answer, I thought that maybe I'd make a video of it and hopefully get some of those sweet YouTube views. So yeah, the question is from somebody called My Mom Broke My Fidget Spinner, Now I'm Sad, which is an amazing, amazing name, by the way. Hi there. I'm amazed by how thoroughly you criticize a movie. You're doing a great job. So, thank you. You really shouldn't be amazed at all. There's absolutely nothing amazing about what I do. I can assure you of that. I'm 17 now, and later I would like to study cinematography and filmmaking. I know this isn't just a phase in my life when I think that this is what I want to do later in life. I am serious about this whole thing. I want to learn movie analyzing and also movie making directing. Yeah, so well, first of all, those are two very different things. Directing and filmmaking, and then more analytical academic work. Although having done both, having both been to film school and learned the technical aspects of film, and getting a graduate degree in film and doing all the thesis and the actual heady analytical work, I do think doing both, or at least having some notions of both, is useful. I subscribed to your channel after watching your review on Good Time, one of my favorite movies. What do you suggest? Where do I start? That's essentially what the video will be about. What kind of books and movies shall I watch? Yeah, so I'll get into that a little bit, and it'll essentially be a very, very small beginner's guide. I mean, there's so many resources out there, but I'll give you a couple examples of where you can start out. Do you think it's a good idea if I write a small review essay after I watch a movie? Yes, I think you maybe should keep a diary. You can use Letterboxd and, log your films, write a review. The more you write, the better you'll get. So yes, I highly encourage you to write after you watch a film and jot your thoughts down. It doesn't have to be super coherent or super well structured, but I think it's a good start. Should I read critics' reviews on films more often? Yes, and you should go back and read like the great critics. Off the top of my head, Roger Ebert, Pauline Kael, Manny Farber, many others, and the French Cahiers du Cinéma guys in the 60s. That'll give you a lot of insight onto how to write a good review, how to do good criticism, actual substantial critical thinking. And then when it comes to like more modern films, yes, my advice to you would be not to follow reviewers because you agree with what they say, but rather because you admire how they say it, or you admire their thoughts about cinema, and it doesn't really matter whether they like the same films you do or not. My personal favorite writers right now would be David Ehrlich and Richard Brody, but I mean, there's tons of other ones. Just find people that write substantial, actual film criticism. And my advice as well, what I do is I don't read reviews before watching films. I jot down my own thoughts, and now that I do these review things, I write down my own review, and then I go see what they say. Once, I've put all my thoughts out there, and once I am not as susceptible to be influenced, or once I'm not pissed off because, as somebody who does this on YouTube, sometimes I'll read somebody else's work and just be really pissed off at the fact that they vocalize exactly the same thing that I was trying to say, except in a far more eloquent, far more beautiful way, and that just reveals my own incompetencies to myself, and that makes me feel very, very sad and depressed. I've been interested in good films since I was about 10 years old. I really never liked those mass-produced, happy-end Hollywood movies, although that doesn't really matter, and that's not what I'm trying to say here. Yeah, again, when I was 17, I remember I hated everything that was big budget, and I just loved indie stuff, and then I realized that most of the stuff that I thought was indie wasn't really indie, and that indie didn't mean shit, actually. I've come around, actually, a lot more now to accepting that film is a populist medium, and I really respect films that can appeal to a large audience, and I really love filmmakers that make films for everyone, which is why I love Spielberg. And I think that actually making films that are both artistically extremely ambitious and try to be, good populist entertainment in a way, I find that that's like the most admirable thing you can do. So yeah, I'm not as cynical about Hollywood films, although I do think a lot of them are bad, but I think 90% of everything's bad. It's not just big budget Hollywood films. Like, you go to a film festival and 90% of like auteur indie films that you see aren't great. It's just the 10% that make it to the top that are always amazing. What do you suggest? How can I become better at film analyzing? Thank you again and have a nice day. Sorry for any mistakes. English isn't my native language. Okay, well, thanks very much for the comment. And, that's exactly what we're going to get into now is some of the tools that you need to start analyzing films in a more detailed way. And essentially, you sound like you need a starting point, and so I'm going to try and give you some starting points, and then you're going to develop your skills yourself. So first things first, I think it's important to establish a distinction between film criticism and film analysis, because they're not the same thing. Film criticism will use analytical elements, but it's far more personality-driven. It's far more personal. You're trying to assess something's value and pass judgment according to your own sensibilities, whether they be political, aesthetic, social, or a mix of all of that. Whereas in analysis, you're really trying to extract substance and meaning from the work while removing yourself as much from the equation as possible. Importantly, you're not trying to assess value or pass judgment. Some people would say that analysis is more objective, whereas criticism is subjective. I don't agree with that at all. I think that people that claim to be objective are full of shit, and they are just well-read enough to sound smart, but not well-read enough to actually understand that they don't know shit. And generally, any ideology that's ever claimed objectivity has always been very dangerous and totalitarian. The truth is that to analyze, it's your perception, it's your eye, and that is conditioned by your upbringing, by your education, by your background, by your culture, by your age, by your life experience, just by so many factors. You're gonna put yourself into any work that you do, no matter how objective you try to make it. And so to me, the main key difference is the idea of trying to pass judgment. That's really the main difference between criticism and analysis. So what I do, very humbly, is more in the criticism side. It's not heavy or deep criticism in any way, certainly not in comparison to some of the wonderful critical think pieces that are written in many great magazines or on many great websites. And that's not the intention, really. I mean, when you're in grad school, the last thing you want to do is super intense, highly researched videos. That's what I wanted, was to do something that was a little more off the cuff, that was a little more easy to produce and simple, and that I could just put out a video once a week and actually produce stuff rather than spend 3 years of my life on a goddamn thesis. So yeah, what I do is criticism. It's very simple, very easygoing criticism. It's nothing too heady. Now that that's out of the way, however, the tools that you need for both and the qualities I feel that make you good at both analysis and criticism are, in my opinion, very similar. So that's good. And first off is, you gotta watch movies. You gotta watch a lot of movies. You gotta be a cinephile. And honestly, that's the easy part. That's the best part. Do try and watch as many classics as you can. There's a reason they're the classics. Again, as to whether or not you enjoy them, you can criticize them and be critical of them, of course, but you gotta know them inside out. In order to do that, and there's a reason they're classics. I mean, in literature, you learn Shakespeare, and in cinema, you learn Hitchcock. That's just the way it is. Watch the classics. As far as which ones you should see, a list of movies you should see, there are tons that are out there. There's the 1001 films to see before you die. There's Roger Ebert's great movies. One thing you can do is go on the Criterion Collection or the Masters of Cinema Collection and scroll through their catalog, see what films are there. there. I would say that in terms of resources for accessing those films, the Criterion Channel is going to come out soon. Obviously, it's going to start off in the US and Canada. That'll be a streaming resource with a lot of classic films, a lot of important films. You've also got Mubi is a really cool website that I use, and if you're a student, it's free, so that's really awesome. And they have very well curated, not so much a lot of classics, but they do have a lot of films from all around the world, and that's one thing that's key, is just not focalizing on a particular genre, on a particular country, but really watching films of all genres, all eras, all countries, trying to be as expansive as possible. Another great resource that's not talked about enough is your local library. You know, with a library card, you can access so many great films. You can borrow those films. Sometimes they're even connected to a streaming service. For example, my university, which already had a great selection of films that you could borrow from when you went to the university library, they were also on what was called Canopy, which is a streaming website that is reserved for people with library cards, and they've got a bunch of films as well. And if you've got a major library, if you live in a big city, again, there's tons and tons of resources to where you can watch those films. So yeah, there's never really been as many resources in terms of actually accessing those films. And in terms of which ones you should watch, like I said, there are tons of lists out there. Don't go by IMDb, because those are voted on by 16-year-old boys, so it's not as interesting. But what I've given you is a decent starting point. Also, one thing that I did in developing sort of my taste and my knowledge of cinema was whenever I saw a film that I loved, I would just try and see every film by that director. So like the first time I saw The Thing, I was like, man, this John Carpenter guy, he's pretty cool. And so I watched basically every John Carpenter I could get my hands on. You know, watched my first Kubrick film and then went through all of Kubrick's catalog. I think that's kind of a way to develop yourself and your taste, and also have a sense of what filmmakers and directors bring to an overall body of work in terms of themes, in terms of style. The second thing you have to do is learn about film history, and obviously, as a result, about real history, because it being an art form, it reflects times and society, and it doesn't exist in a vacuum. But in terms of resources for learning about the history of cinema, the place to start is Bordwell and Thompson's Film History. Is it the best resource? I don't know. There are people that are quite critical of it. Again, if you want to criticize something, you better know it really well. Essentially, if you go to film school, this is the first book that you will be given to read, so it's kind of a classic. There's a reason it's a classic. From then on, you can read a bunch of others if you don't find it satisfactory enough, but that's a pretty decent starting point. I would also add one thing that's a really fun place to start, and that's Mark Cousin's Story of Film. You can find it in book form, but it's also a television series that you can find on DVD. Even if you're a film expert, it's a really fun watch, but in terms of a starting off point, I think it's really quite fascinating. Every episode covers a specific era and a specific country and a specific movement, so it's really well segmented, it's well organized. But the thing that it has going for it the most is that when Mark Cousin talks about films, when he analyzes sequences, you actually see those sequences. And that's just super entertaining and educational. One of the terrible things you're going to come across while reading a bunch of literature about cinema is that people are going to describe in detail films and sequences and shots, either of films that you haven't seen or of films that you have seen but that you don't remember that well because you don't have it in front of your eyes right then and there, and so it becomes very dry and extremely hard to engage with. And that's something that Story of Film addresses. And it also, to segue back to that first tip, provides you with just huge filmographies of which to dive through and educate yourself. All right, third thing is that you gotta learn how to actually analyze images, how to look at moving pictures and how they're articulated together and edited together. You gotta learn the technical jargon, which is inherent to really any profession and any academic subject. Now again, a decent starting point there is Bordwell and Thompson's Film Art, which offers you a very basic beginner's guide to how to analyze film. And if you want to analyze sound, the ultimate resource is a French researcher called Michel Chion. He really is the reference point for studying sound in cinema. Audio, vision, sound on screen, and film sound art are fantastic starting places for learning not just how to watch films, but how to listen to them. And then, of course, there are a ton of other books that you can read. If you're in French circles, Jacques Aumont becomes very important. Or Gilles Deleuze, his time image and movement image have been translated in English. He's, again, kind of an authority on cinema. But he's a philosopher and comes at it with very philosophical concepts about cinema, so it's kind of a difficult starting point. I would definitely dive into other areas before you go in there, but again, I mean, you really can't escape Gilles Deleuze, so at a certain point, especially if you do something a little heavier in terms of university education, like a grad school degree, you're gonna go through it no matter what. Hi everyone, this is me interjecting from the future. I was editing the video and I realized there were 2 other resources that I wanted to mention that I forgot. So this is me just adding them in. The first one I want to talk about is Walter Murch's In the Blink of an Eye. Walter Murch is an absolutely legendary film editor, and in terms of getting into the art of editing, whether it be for analysis or actually practicing the art of editing, it's definitely a resource that I would highly, highly recommend. And of course, of all the resources and the books that I've talked about, there is one aspect that I really haven't mentioned, which is actually a fundamental and extremely important aspect of filmmaking, and that's the script writing process and the art of screenwriting. And in that case, I think the absolute best resource to start with is Robert McKee's Story. Most Hollywood films follow just the basic steps that you'll find in this book, and it's certainly, I think, the ultimate resource in terms of how to create character arcs, how to structure your script. Is it perfect? My guess is no, and then it does suffer from the problem that it's been read by so many screenwriters. You do tend to see a lot of big budget Hollywood films follow the same structures and have the same arcs, and it makes everything feel kind of a little samey, but there's a reason it works. There's a reason everybody reads this book, and again, it's a really good place to start. Story by Robert McKee. Okay, and finally, my last tip, and that is to cultivate yourself in every other way, in every other art form. Go to the museum, go see photo expos, go and analyze photographies by the greatest photographers, go and observe paintings by the greatest painters. You'll learn everything you need to know about lighting and composition. Listen to music, read books, read philosophy, read the news. Just enrich yourself as much as possible with art and culture and philosophy and things that are outside of film. One of the things that I find made film such a rich art form very early on is that when it started out and there were no real rules or no real reference points, people came at it from so many different vantage points. It was an amalgamation of people coming in from musical backgrounds and theater and opera and post-World War II and baby boomer generation, but really a lot in the last 25, 30 years, people have been coming into film with film as their only reference point. And, you know, I consider myself part of that problem, is that I grew up loving film and watching film and not really interesting myself enough in other art forms. And I feel that makes very close-minded, kind of incestuous filmmaking that really doesn't draw enough from all these other incredible sources. And yeah, I find that makes filmmakers very similar in a way, and it kind of decreases the richness of the world of filmmaking. Again, go to the museum, read books, read philosophy. All that stuff is useful, whether it be for creating films and the creative process, or obviously for analyzing films. You know, you can come at a film and analyze it only from a philosophical standpoint and only use Nietzsche and not have any sort of, you know, technical editing reference point. And that'll be interesting. That'll be your thing. You really gotta open your mind and look outside the box and, you know, learn as much as you can about filmmaking, but also learn as much as you can about other art forms, because it's all worth it in the long run, and it's all going to make you either a better filmmaker or a better film student. But, you know, last thing is, you're young, you're 17, you're just gonna find your own path into filmmaking, into film analysis. Don't worry about it. You're gonna get better. You're just gonna keep doing it, and it's gonna come to you way more naturally. And you're gonna hone your own skills, and yeah, just I hope that this video was in any way helpful, and yeah, just thanks for subscribing and commenting, and for being so very nice, and yeah, until next time, see ya.